On the day after Christmas 1900, a man climbed 160 stone steps to the door of a lighthouse at the edge of the world. He knocked. No one answered. He pushed the door open. The clock on the wall had stopped. A chair lay overturned on the floor. On the table, a meal sat half-eaten, cold, waiting for men who would never sit down again. 3 lighthouse keepers had vanished from this rock. No bodies, no blood, no boat, no witnesses, because there was no one within 16 miles of them. For more than 120 years, no one has been able to say for certain what happened on this island. Tonight, we're going to walk through every clue that was left behind. And by the end, you'll have to decide for yourself which is more frightening: the explanation that makes sense or the one that doesn't. This is the story of Eileen Moore, and this is everything we know. To understand what happened, you first have to understand where it happened, because this is not an ordinary place. Off the far northwest coast of Scotland, past the Outer Hebrides, past the last villages, past the point where the land finally gives up, there is a scatter of 7 small islands in the open North Atlantic. They are called the Flannan Isles, and the largest of them is a wedge of black rock called Eileen Moore. It is barely 500 feet across. Its cliffs rise straight out of a violent sea. There is no beach. There is no harbor. There is no shelter. Waves here don't lap at the shore, they detonate against it, throwing white water higher than a house. For centuries, no one lived here. The only visitors were shepherds who ferried sheep across to graze on the thin grass. But even they wouldn't stay. They would land, tend the animals, and leave before dark, because the Flannan Isles had a reputation. The locals called it a haunted place. They spoke of spirits on the rock, of little people, of something that watched from the cliffs. Sailors gave the islands a wide berth, and no shepherd, no matter how hardy, would spend a single night on Eileen Moore. Then, in 1895, the modern world arrived. Ships crossing the Atlantic to Scottish ports kept running aground in these waters. Something had to warn them. So the Northern Lighthouse Board made a decision. They would build a lighthouse on the one island no one dared to sleep on. It took 4 years. Every stone, every beam, every pane of glass had to be hauled up those cliffs by hand and by crane. When it was finished in 1899, the Flannan Isles lighthouse stood 75 feet tall, its light visible for 25 miles in every direction. And now, 3 men at a time would live on the rock the shepherds feared alone, for weeks on end, with nothing but the sea, the wind, and each other. What no one realized, when they lit that lamp for the first time, was that, within a single year, the island would take all 3 of them. By December of 1900, 3 keepers were stationed on Eileen Moore. The senior man was James Duckett. He was 44 years old, an experienced principal keeper who had spent more than 20 years tending lights up and down the Scottish coast. He was steady, respected, and careful. Back on the mainland, in a cottage on the Isle of Lewis, he had a wife and 4 children waiting for him to come home. The second was Thomas Marshall, the assistant keeper. He was younger, unmarried, and by every account he was diligent, almost anxious about doing his job correctly. That detail matters more than it seems, and we'll come back to it. The third man was Donald MacArthur. He was not even supposed to be there. MacArthur was an occasional keeper, a substitute, brought in to cover for the regular first assistant who was homesick. He was known locally as a tough man, quick-tempered, the kind who settled arguments with his fists. That detail matters too. These 3 men had a simple, unbreakable routine. Keep the lamp filled, light it at dusk, trim the wick through the night, extinguish it at dawn, record the weather every single day. The light could never fail because out here, a dark lighthouse meant a ship might die. Every 2 weeks, a supply ship called the Hesperus would arrive from the mainland, drop off food and fuel, and swap one keeper for another. The last relief had come on the 7th of December. Everything had been normal. The superintendent who visited that day, a man named Robert Muirhead, shook hands with all three keepers and wished them well. He would later realize he was the last person from the outside world to ever see them alive. Between the 7th and the 15th of December, no one on the mainland thought about Eileen Moore. The men were doing their jobs. The light was burning. There was no reason to worry. And then, on the night of December 15th, a ship passed the islands in the dark, and its crew noticed something that should have been impossible. The steamer was called the Archtor. It was crossing the Atlantic, bound for the Scottish port of Leith, when it passed near the Flannan Isles around midnight on December 15th. The night was foul, and as the crew looked toward Eileen Moore, they saw only darkness. The great light, the light that was supposed to be visible for 25 miles, was not burning. For a ship at sea, this was alarming. A dead lighthouse in the middle of a shipping route is a trap. The Archtor's crew noted it. But here is the first cruel twist in the story. Their radio, their means of reporting it, failed. The message never reached the Northern Lighthouse Board. The Archtor docked days later. The report was passed along slowly, and by the time anyone in authority understood that the Flannan light had gone dark, days had already passed, and the light stayed dark night after night while no one came. In fact, people on the Isle of Lewis, 16 miles away, the nearest land, later said they too had noticed the Flannan light was missing on clear nights. For roughly 10 days, the lighthouse had been dark, and no one had raised the alarm. Finally, the relief ship Hesperus was sent, but bad weather delayed it again and again. It was supposed to arrive around the 20th of December. It didn't reach the island until the 26th, the day after Christmas. Its captain was a man named Jim Harvey. As the Hesperus approached Eileen Moore, Harvey did what ships always did. He sounded the steam whistle to let the keepers know their relief had arrived. He waited for the men to appear on the landing, as they always did. No one came. He fired a signal rocket into the gray sky, a flare that would be impossible to miss. No one came. The flagpole on the island was bare. There were no supply boxes waiting at the landing as there should have been. There was no movement, no smoke, no sign that any living thing was on that rock at all. Captain Harvey sent one man ashore to climb those 160 steps and find out what had happened. His name was Joseph Moore, and in a few minutes, he was going to walk into a scene he would never be able to forget. Joseph Moore climbed alone. Up the steep steps carved into the cliff face, into the wind, toward the silent tower. The outer gate was shut. The main door was shut. He opened them and stepped inside, calling out for the three men he knew. Silence answered him. He moved through the lighthouse, and detail by detail, the wrongness of it settled over him. The clock on the wall had stopped, run down, unwound, meaning no one had been there to tend it for days. The beds were unmade. The fire in the grate was dead and cold, long cold, not the fire of men who had stepped out for a few minutes. In the kitchen, a meal had been left behind, and in the middle of the floor, a single wooden chair lay tipped over on its side, as if someone had stood up from the table so suddenly, so violently, that they'd knocked it down and never picked it back up. Moore searched the whole station, every room, every corner. The three keepers were gone. He ran back down to the landing and shouted the news to the ship. Captain Harvey sent more men ashore, and together they went over the island inch by inch. They searched the tower, the outbuildings, the cliffs, the landings. And as they searched, the strange details multiplied. Two of the three keepers' oilskins, the heavy waterproof coats they wore against the storms, were gone. That meant 2 men had dressed for the worst possible weather and gone outside. But the third set of oilskins, belonging to Donald MacArthur, was still hanging on its hook inside. Which meant MacArthur, the substitute, the tough one, had gone out into a deadly storm without his coat, in December, on a cliff, in the North Atlantic. Men did not do that, unless something made them run. And then they reached the western landing. And what they found there turned a tragedy into a mystery that has never closed. The West Landing sat on the more exposed side of the island, and it was built to survive anything the ocean could throw at it. What the searchers found there did not look possible. A wooden crate that had been fixed inside a crevice, a crate holding ropes and crane handles, was gone. And this crate had been stored 110 feet above the level of the sea, more than 10 stories up. Its contents were scattered across the rocks. Iron railings, bolted into solid stone, were twisted and bent. A section of iron track had been torn loose. A block of stone weighing more than a ton had been shifted from its place. And the crane, high up on the cliff, was damaged with ropes tangled around it, as though the sea itself had reached up and grabbed it. Everything pointed to one thing. At some point, a wall of water, enormous, freakish, far higher than the normal waves, had come out of the Atlantic and smashed the western side of Ilion more than 100 feet above sea level. To the investigators, this began to suggest a story, and it went like this. Marshall and Duckett, the two men whose oilskins were missing, had gone down to the West Landing to secure equipment that the storm was threatening to wash away. Remember Thomas Marshall, the anxious young assistant? There was a reason he'd rush out into bad weather. Earlier that year, Marshall had been fined a portion of his wages for letting equipment get damaged in a previous storm. He could not afford for it to happen again. So when the sea started tearing at the landing, the two men pulled on their coats and went down to save the gear. And while they were down there exposed, 100 feet above the water, a rogue wave came. But that story has a hole in it, a hole the size of a man, because it doesn't explain the third keeper, the one who left his coat behind, and it doesn't explain the chair. Here is the version the official investigation, led by Superintendent Robert Muirhead, finally settled on. Two men, Duckett and Marshall, went down to the landing in their oilskins to secure the gear. The third man, Donald MacArthur, stayed behind in the warmth. He was at the table, maybe eating, maybe watching from the window. And then MacArthur saw it coming. A monstrous wave, rising against the cliffs, rolling toward the two men below who couldn't see it. He didn't stop to think. He didn't stop to grab his coat. He knocked his chair over as he leapt up, and he ran out the door, down the steps into the storm, screaming a warning to the men he could not save. And the wave took all three of them, in an instant, and carried them into a sea that never gave them back. That single explanation accounts for nearly everything. The two missing coats and the one left behind, the overturned chair, the abandoned meal, the damage at the landing. It is the most likely answer. It is almost certainly what happened. Almost, but almost certainly is not certainly. And into that gap, for over a century, darker theories have poured. Some pointed at Donald MacArthur, the tough, hot-tempered substitute. What if there had been no wave at all? What if, trapped on a tiny rock with two other men for weeks, a fight broke out? What if MacArthur killed the other two, threw their bodies into the sea, and then, realizing what he'd done, threw himself in after them? A murder-suicide 75 feet above the Atlantic, with no one left alive to tell it. Others refused to accept any earthly answer at all. The Flannan Isles had been feared for centuries, remember. So the stories came, that a sea serpent had risen and taken the men, that a giant bird had carried them off, that a ghost ship, a phantom the locals called by name, had drifted to the rock and stolen its keepers, that foreign spies had abducted them, that the island itself, the haunted rock the shepherds fled before nightfall, had simply claimed the three men who dared to sleep on it. And then, years after the men vanished, one more piece of evidence appeared, and it made everything worse. A logbook with entries, in the keeper's own hand, describing something that should terrify you if any of it were actually true. The story spread that the keeper's logbook had been found, and that its final entries were deeply disturbing. Supposedly, in the days before the disappearance, the log recorded a storm unlike anything the men had ever seen, even though the lighthouse itself, a fortress of stone, was never in any real danger from wind. The entries claimed that Duckett, the steady veteran, had gone silent and withdrawn. That Marshall was gripped by fear, and that Donald MacArthur, the hard man who settled things with his fists, the man who had surely seen 100 storms, had been found crying. The final entry, the story goes, read simply, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." It's a chilling image. 3 experienced men, alone on a rock, reduced to weeping and prayer by something in the storm they couldn't name, and then silence. There is only one problem. None of it was real. Investigators and later researchers who dug into the original records found that the real logbook's final entry was made on December 13th, with only routine weather notes jotted on a slate on the morning of the 15th. There were no entries about a terrifying storm, no line about Duckett falling silent, no mention of MacArthur in tears, and no dramatic final words about God. Those haunting entries were invented, added to the story years later, by writers and storytellers who wanted to make an already strange event feel supernatural. The real keepers left no message of fear. They left only a half-finished workday and an overturned chair. But by then, the legend had a life of its own. In 1912, a poet named Wilfred Gibson published a famous poem about the Flannan Isles, adding even more invented details: 3 untouched meals, a toppled chair, and eerie stillness. Millions read it, and slowly the poem's fiction and the real facts blurred together, until almost no one could tell where the truth ended and the ghost story began. So strip it all away. The sea serpents, the ghost ship, the weeping men, the fake logbook, and you are left with the truth as it actually stands more than 120 years later. 3 men lived on a rock the world had always feared. One dark December afternoon, something drove 2 of them down to the edge of the sea and drove the third out of his chair, and through a door so fast he left his coat behind and never came back for it. The ocean rearranged iron and stone 100 feet above its own surface, and then it went calm and quiet and gave up nothing. The most likely answer is a rogue wave. Cold, natural, indifferent. It's probably the truth. But we will never know for certain. There were no witnesses. There were no bodies. There was no final word. There is only an empty lighthouse, a stopped clock, and a chair lying on its side on a stone floor. Frozen in the exact moment 3 men stopped existing. James Duckett left behind a wife and 4 children who never learned how their father died. Thomas Marshall and Donald MacArthur simply vanished from the world. And the light on Eilean Moor, the light they died to keep burning, still turns today, automated now, alone on its haunted rock, warning ships away from the place that took its keepers. So I'll leave the question with you. The wave that reshaped stone 100 feet in the air, the coat left hanging on its hook, the chair that no one ever picked back up. Do you believe the sea took them quickly, cruelly, and by accident? Or do you think something happened on that rock in the dark, that the ocean was simply kind enough to hide? Tell me what you believe in the comments. And if this story kept you here to the end, there are more places on this earth where people walked in and never walked out. I'll take you to the next one.